Okay, so we'd like to move on straight to the next session, which is the keynote addresses. And I'd like to introduce my brother, my colleague, and my senior, Professor Cesar Atuire. So Professor Cesar Atuire is a professor of global health ethics at the University of Oxford and an adjunct professor at the Department of Philosophy and Classics. He's a philosopher and health ethicist who works both in Ghana and then also in Oxford. He's currently leading a team of highly qualified colleagues from across the globe on a Wellcome Discovery Award titled Moving Beyond Solidarity Rhetoric in Global Health. While visiting, he also works on the foundational chapters of a book that is currently under review with Oxford University Press. I think it's already out. So the book, which was launched recently, focuses on the meta-ethical and practical discussions of global health ethics issues as seen from the perspective of contemporary African philosophy. Please, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Professor Cesar Alemsina Atuire to give us the...
Thank you very much, Professor Paulina Tindana. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share some thoughts at the beginning of this global forum. When I was asked to speak, I thought about what we do as a traditional practice in where I come from, the northern part of Ghana. I come from a small village in the northern part of Ghana, which is close to where Gordon and Paulina come from. It's just that my town is nicer than their town, so, so that's fine. But anyway, when the elders and leaders are gathering to have a meeting, usually somebody maybe, in the community prepares them for the meeting, either by singing or dancing or reciting some form of poetry. Now, these are three things that I cannot do. I can't sing, I can't recite poetry, and my dancing is pretty dismal. So, but the goal of that preparation is to remind the elders and the leaders who are supposed to be meeting of two things. One, the issues that they will be deliberating are not other people's issues. They are part of the problem. And you now begin to see where I'm going to go with this keynote talk as ethicists. We're part of the problem. So you remind them in an artistic way that they're not coming to discuss other people's problems. Because one of the challenges of global health is that we're always trying to solve other people's problems. Secondly, these ceremonies are usually accompanied, or this opening is usually accompanied by pouring libation to the ancestors. Now, when you pour libation to the ancestors, it seems like a religious tradition, and it is indeed, but it has a philosophical meaning which is important. It means that whenever we gather together to reflect on the present, we are carrying the weight of history. Whatever is happening now is part of the result. It's partly due to what happened in the past, and that conditions the present. And we will also be history. So let us not consider the issues that we will be deliberating on as just time-bound. We are only... we've inherited a past that conditions our present. And what we will do may condition the present of people in the future. So keeping this in mind, this background, which I'll call a Bulsa setting, I just wanted us to have a few thoughts on power and global health ethics and global health research ethics. So let's start. And allow me to say something. I'm terrible with slides. I actually detest them. But when you are invited to a conference these days, you keep getting emails from the organizers. Do send your slides. And as the time draws nearer, the tone of the emails gets, so we're all forced to do it. I'd rather have a conversation without slides, but this is the world in which we live. And these are part of the things that I will be questioning. So, ethics conference, let's just think about it. What would be a failure of the GFBR? If this becomes an exercise of ethics buzzwording, and what do I mean by ethics buzzwording? Ethics buzzwording is we come together, we start talking about low resource settings, marginalized communities, vulnerable populations, inequities, and we just keep throwing these words. We run the risk of falling into, well, I may even fall, into ethics buzzwording. And let us keep that in mind. The second thing is what I call reverse global health troping. Global health is linked with a lot of tropes, right? So we're always criticizing global health tropes about, yeah? Is this okay? So we're always criticizing global health tropes. I hope my hand doesn't get tired. About, the influence of global north on the global south. And therefore, we need to change leadership so that the global south voices will be heard. And the fact that, there is inequity in the global health space. So these are the tropes that we're constantly using because tropes are, narratives that keep repeating themselves. So once we get into the ethics space, we go into the reverse troping. And the reverse troping is simply a case of saying, well, let us reverse this thing. But what we keep doing is that in reversing it, we are simply just sometimes substituting actors and not questioning frameworks. So we say, well, let us have more lead authors from the global south. But history has taught us that, it is not just a question of changing people that solves the issues, but it's a question of actually questioning the system. And in a country like Ghana, where we live, where we are right now, it is clear from the independence struggles that you can actually change the colonizers and substitute them with local leaders, and they will continue the colonizing system. So that is what is happening across the continent in many places. And therefore, let us be careful about reverse global health ethics troping as we go into these deliberations, because otherwise we'll come out with declarations that, oh, research has to be led by global south researchers. Great. Let it be led by them. And what are they going to do that is different? Then the third thing is, ethics blame shifting. That will be one of the risks of our conversations today. Ethics blame shifting is simply always thinking that the problem is other people. So it is either publishers who have all these, publishing cost charges, or it is institutions. Yet we, those who are actually making these claims, are part of those institutions. And we actually reproduce the system. So while we're going into these reflections, my real desire is just to wake us all up to the fact that we are part of the problem. So, what I'm trying to do here, and since Paulina said I'm in a department of philosophy and classics, I always have to remember my classics background. They have this ab exterioribus ad interiora. While we're looking at the external things that are wrong, let us remember that there is a challenge for us personally to also look at the coherence of our own actions. So, having said this, let's just go back to the very basic questions. Sometimes it is important to start from very simple questions. When we talk about health research, what we're trying to do at the end of the day is that we say we're trying to generate new knowledge that improves healthcare, and the quality of life. That perhaps is a description that almost all of us can accept. But then as soon as we say this, the problems start. You know, knowledge. What is knowledge? Whose knowledge? And how is it produced? Some of you have heard me speak before. When Europe was suffering and reeling under COVID-19, no European country thought it was necessary to invite experts from Liberia and Sierra Leone to come and help them manage their pandemic, when people in Europe had never really managed a nationwide disease in their lifetimes. So the knowledge that, district health officers in Sierra Leone have, perhaps is not considered knowledge. So how do we classify knowledge? And, whose knowledge and how is it produced? And then secondly, we talk about improving health. Improving health for who? Are there expendables in our communities or in our global societies whose lives do not matter? Now, health research is about generating power. It's about, because the knowledge we generate is power. Knowledge is power. And it is done by people who live and work within relationships that are tinged with power. If we look at our research teams, we look at our universities, there are power structures. In our relationships, so we're talking about power, partnerships between institutions, global north, global south, global south, global south, south, but even within our own teams and within our own institutions, there are power structures, and power is at play between PIs and postdocs. Now, all this means that the point I'm trying to make is that global health research is simply a lot about power, dominion, negotiation, suppression, or liberation. And therefore, we cannot ignore considerations of power when we're talking about global health research. And the theme of this year's Global Forum is resilience, equity, and power. Those are the three things that we're supposed to be reimagining. Sometimes we use these words, resilience, who knows what it means? What does it mean? If we go back to the root of the word, resilire simply means something that you kick and it gets a dent and it bounces back. But why should it be kicked anyway? And yes, we talk about equity, equitas, but I think the key thing we need to keep in mind is that what we're doing is actually something that is about negotiation, use, exercise of power, and different types of power. Now, with that said, let's look at a conception of power. It's very difficult to define power. And when I say conception, I'm making a distinction between a concept and a conception. This is John Rawls. A concept is, what one can say you can define essentially. But a conception is the way we actually define it. And generally, nobody has a concept of something like power. We all have conceptions of power. And therefore, any conception cannot claim to be the only conception. And this is where we need a pluriversal understanding of these notions. Now, power can be defined in several ways, but generally it refers to the ability or the capacity to influence, control, or direct the behavior of others or the course of events. Now, this means something if we accept this understanding of power. It means that power in itself requires conscious intent because it is directing and influencing the course of events or other people. It changes things. So some will, some intention has to be there in order to direct power. Now, sometimes we use the word loosely, so those of us who are familiar with the African context often hear people say, well, we have power cuts. No, what we have is electricity cut. It's not power, it's energy. But we tend to use it analogously, and we attribute power to non-intentional beings. However, power is essentially something that has to do with a conscious intent. Now, okay, there are other ways of thinking about power, which, Bruno Latour, for example, talks about, power being, a form of, actants when you create structures that begin to exercise power. But the thing is that these structures have been created by somebody, by some intention anyway, even though they are continuing to perpetuate the power system. Now, if we stay with the conception of power as requiring conscious intent, then power becomes an issue of ethical concern, because ethics is about human acts, is the normative science of human acts, right? Not acts of humans, but human acts, the acts that engage our humanity. The fact that I drank coffee and it is digesting through my body now is, yeah, it's an act of a human, but it's not of moral concern. But those acts that engage my real humanity, those are the human acts, and they are the subject of our ethical concerns. And therefore, if power is always exercised with a conscious intent, then power is something of ethical concern, and we need to pay attention to power. Now, the way power, when we talk about power, and by the way, who's keeping the time, just let me know so that if I'm running out of time, I can stop. Who should I be looking out to, or who will tell me? Okay. I have 5 minutes. Okay, all right, thank you. So 5 minutes, then I'll run through this quickly. Power imbalance. This is something that we will hear a lot about in the case studies. But I want to say that power imbalance is not inherently negative. Sometimes we actually need power imbalance for things to work. Most of us here are either teachers or parents or both. If you're teaching in a classroom and there isn't power imbalance, you're not going to run that place. And if you have children, you need power imbalance sometimes to keep the house going. Now, the issue about, power imbalance being problematic is when we look at how the power is acquired. So that is where history comes into play. How is it that such a person, institution, or group of people have so much power? And how did they acquire it? Through violence, through suppression, through colonization, or what? And then, how is it exercised? And how do they justify that exercise of that power? This is where the ethics comes in. And if we're thinking about equitable partnerships between institutions and groups that have an equal power, then we should be asking that power that the group that has the higher power is exercising, how did they acquire it? Then, how do they exercise it? And how do they justify it? And this is where the accountability frameworks and all that come into play. So power imbalance becomes ethically problematic when it leads to domination, exclusion, and silencing. Now, today's world is particularly complex because quite often we're dealing with what we call institutionalized power. And this is when power becomes embedded within bureaucratic, financial, and epistemic systems. And so what then happens is that power becomes anonymized. So even though there is an intent, a will, a conscious will that has directed that power, it has now become institutionalized. And once it becomes institutionalized, it becomes unaccountable because you do not even know who to hold responsible. It is diffused. So looking at our research, research context, there are many things that we do and we reproduce without knowing who actually created them. Why do ethics committees have so much power? Anyway, I'll leave it hanging there. And I could go on about this. But then what happens is that when power becomes institutionalized, it can actually naturalize inequalities. We suddenly declare that certain group of people are, vulnerable, and we have vulnerabilized them and marginalized them. And we then, kind of stand up in our sanctimoniosity to defend them. Anyway. There's also another aspect to power that I just want to consider, and then I'll go to the conclusions. So there's something that, especially with the modern era, it started in the modern era, and it is growing and it keeps growing. And with artificial intelligence, it's going to grow even more. It is when moral capacity is not proportional to power. So ideally, as your power grows, your moral capacity also needs to grow. But what we have today is having a lot of power without a proportional moral capacity. And this creates to harm and injustice. Moral awareness should expand alongside technological and institutional power. Otherwise, decision makers risk moral blindness, producing harm, sometimes not necessarily out of malice. You know, Hannah Arendt, when she talks about the banality of evil, but it's just because that's the way we do things. And it can also arise out of just a sense of detachment, because sometimes those in power are actually quite privileged, and privilege produces detachment. And detachment can actually generate a lot of harm. There's this saying in Spanish that I like. It's not, linked to research, but José Luis Perales says, "Es tu distancia estando cerca lo que más me duele." It is your distance being so close to me that really hurts me, because you ignore me. Now, we need to increase our moral imagination. So this leads to what I think we should keep in mind as we're going through the GFBR, which is what I call ethical self-reflexivity. And ethical self-reflexivity, by the way, is not positionality. Because, I find sometimes these positionality declarations very problematic, because they become, an excuse to do what I want because I've declared my positionality. But after declaring your positionality, you have to be critical of that positionality. And that is when it becomes ethical self-reflexivity. And so, as we're going through these issues, the cases that we'll be analyzing during the GFBR, and looking at how different actors form partnerships and how these partnerships can be fair and unfair, we also need to keep exercising this reflexivity. Otherwise, we can also become people who reproduce the broader social structures that generate the inequity that we're trying to fight. And ethical self-reflexivity, what is great about it is that it's not about moral certainty, but moral maturity. Because moral certainty is actually a sign of moral adolescence. I'm just going to conclude quickly by referring to an author that I'm sure few people would have heard about. But these times, especially the periods we're living through in many countries, have driven me quite often to going back to read books from the 1930s and 1940s, because the playbook is very similar. And Romano Guardini was a philosopher theologian who was kicked out of his university just because he was trying to be sincere. He wasn't even a rebel. He was just trying to write the truth. And he says, power is a responsibility that must be shaped by moral insight. When power grows without corresponding ethical depth, it becomes dehumanizing and dangerous. And true mastery, and when he talks about it, it's not domination over others or nature, but it's mastery over one's own power. And I think we should keep that in mind as we're going through the reflections, because ethics committees also have power, ethicists have power, researchers have power, and we have to acquire that mastery over our own power, and not just dominion over pathogens or over other researchers, because that will not solve the ethical problem we have. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Atuire. I think he's given us a lot to think about. He's talked about the issue of power and what we use power for. And I think that's something that we would reflect on as we go through the various sessions today and tomorrow. Please keep note of all the questions that you have. We would have a session where you can engage with the keynote speakers to address these questions, any questions that you may have. But at this stage, to the next keynote speaker, to the next keynote speaker. Is it okay? Okay, all right. So it's my pleasure to introduce Key Nambiar, who is hello? Okay. So Dr. Devaki Nambiar is a program manager, a program director for the health equity at the George Institute for Global Health, India. She also has appointments at the Municipal Academy of Higher Education in India, the University of New South Wales, Australia, and then the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in the USA. She is a health policy and systems researcher with over 2 decades of experience working in India and other low and middle income countries on decision-making demand-driven research. And ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Devaki Nambiar.
Quite clearly, even the mic doesn't want her to go on and on with that information. Hi, everybody. I have not followed instructions. I don't have slides. I could probably do some dancing and singing, but I'll say some comments first. As Paulina said, I'm a health policy and systems researcher. I dabble in ethics. I try to understand ethics, but I'm by no means grounded in the way that many of you are. I am, however, freshly returned from a workshop on participatory action research, and it was hosted by one of India's most progressive social development research institutions, Praxis. So I'm fresh from that, and I would first of all like to acknowledge their contributions to my thinking. All errors are mine, and also that accounts for any failure I will have in terms of reading the room and what I should be saying, because it derives from some of that. I was asked to talk about equitable partnerships in practice as a researcher, as a practicing researcher. But in the planning committee, as we developed the purview of this forum, and in the background paper, we specify this. We framed partnerships as a process of world making. So these comments are no less ambitious than talking about world making. And how will I do this? I propose to do some hopping, island hopping, if you will. You're all seated in islands. And I will present some stories from different projects that I'm involved with that are scattered across the world, some that I've studied and some that I've had the privilege of being involved with. You can read about some of these in a paper that we've published. Some of you have heard about one of many tools that look at equity and ethics in research. Is called the Equity tool. We can look at all that later in our discussions, but I will summarize some of that for you. And so in this work, as in the work that many of you do, we rely on a broad definition of partnership in the first instance. So I do want to sort of call that out in starting. So partnership then refers to a range of relations in a research endeavor. This could, of course, be conventional research partners, but it could also be partnerships with people whose realities are being researched. Right, so they may themselves be researchers if our methods are participatory or not, as the case more often is. So I'm going to hop across these different islands. I might hop back on some of them. I think there's 3 islands, 5 hops, okay? So the first island, on the first island, I'd like to describe a collaboration that's contracted to a UK-based institution. It has partners all over what many of us call the majority world, others of us call In one of the quotes about this work, one of the researchers says, quote, "We have always understood capacity strengthening as something that we all need in the project, not something that LMIC researchers or partners need. We have also understood it as something that we all need, and different partners are in different positions of expertise to share capacity and strengthen each other." So that's the kind of premise that we started off with, end quote. This was a good lesson to me. I think this feels familiar to many of us who have been in long partnerships. Partners need each other in partnerships. Capacities of various kinds need strengthening. We are all learners. But too often, maybe as often, I see what I call epistemic arrogation. This is connected, Caesar, to your idea of institutionalization of power, where, without justification, we accept and do not question who is the learner and teacher in a partnership, who has and who doesn't have capacity that needs to be built. Declarations are made with limited discussion or elaboration, often rehearsing the past. You talked about this as well, Caesar. I have had my capacity built, and therefore that is and always will be my role. As research marches on, I will always need to be taught, never deciding what is to be learned in the first place. But in partnerships that I've seen, we are forever teachers as much as we are learners. We are deciding what to show and tell others as much as we see and learn from them. So that's island one. Island two. So on the second island, I'd like to describe an observational study in India. It's a study looking at chronic disease in a rural community, a community that faces a host of various intersecting disadvantages. A team member described the work as follows, quote, "For the first several months, we did nothing. We just went into the community, we spoke to the community, we tried to build bridges with them, tried to identify what are the various social groups that have influence in the region and who we can talk to make them partners. We strongly took a lot of help from the ASHA. ASHAs in India, by the way, is a voluntary community health worker who receives performance-based incentives. So we strongly took a lot of help from the ASHA because they belong to the community, and this being a health issue, we have to do it with support of the local community. When we developed our field force, the field team, we hired people from within the same community." To me, when I heard this in interviews, and as I say it to you now, my head is screaming, how in the world is this not doing anything, right? To me, this is the very work of partnership. Communication, understanding power, relying on each other, ensuring inclusion, building representation on my team, and so on. This is not nothing. In other partnerships that we have, we spend time walking, eating, cooking, playing, listening and visiting each other, and sometimes fighting. Making sure we're doing enough of that, in my experience, has been core to partnerships, not just Teams calls, right? Remembering someone's favorite smell or dish, being able to talk about that time when, this storytelling we do with each other, which I see in this very room with people who are part of the legacy of this forum, that is the stuff of partnerships, I think. Island 3. On this third island, we have a project based in Australia. The project is concerned with injuries and the health of people from First Nations. The team is entirely led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons. And in the paper that we've written about this, their process is described as follows. Quote, "Emphasis was placed on the specific use of strength-based approaches and indigenous research approaches and epistemologies, including the use of dance, art, and music for knowledge transfer, as well as methods like yarning to derive insights and gather data. These were not seen as scientific, they noted, by journals and others in the scientific community, and the publications required protracted correspondence between authors and editors, with the former justifying the value of indigenous methods of research and impact they generate in communities. This additional back and forth and the commensurate delay in publication was a trade-off that they made in service of equity," end quote. I hope what this process describes is how much more is done, not how little is done, in decolonial science. the work, the science, and relationality of partnership, and specifically work in an indigenous context, requires befitting methods. A lot of what is to be done and followed is tacit, oral, emergent, and yet you occupy multiple worlds, or islands perhaps. You embrace pluriversality, as Cesar mentioned, framed by Walter Mignolo and others. For those who are wondering what this term is, pluriversality is about working with multiple ways of being and of knowing. It actually usually requires an ethics of care. Using care, this group, they used care, they used oodles of patience and boodles of time. They were able to honor and advance their knowledges, as can we. And also with care, patience, and time, we may justify our defiance of colonial notions of rigor. It takes nothing less than this kind of care, creativity, patience, and time, as my friends at Praxis say, to disrupt the colonial library. So we need and must take the time. All right, so we've hopped on these three islands. Where does that leave us? What does a future roadmap look like, perhaps, that we could discuss in this forum? What is the world we are making? Let's hop back to Island 1. Back on Island 1, I'm literally scratching my head about the equity tool. We've actually been developing it for years, changing it, testing it, stretching it, scrapping parts of it. We're quite clear that at no point will this tool be done. At no point will this tool be definitive. In conventional terms, it may and probably will keep failing. But then comes the good part. We change it. It's no longer failing. It's changing, right? So this tool, like any other tool or protocol or roadmap, is successful only if also useful as unintended. Equity is among a panoply of emerging tools because I'm not convinced there is a single coherent roadmap to equitable partnerships. The very fact of standardizing and harmonizing, removing doubt and creating symmetry, this disciplining and taming, is an empire-building task. Cesar, you talked about this. And about reverse global health troping. So you have an idea. There are many similar arguments like this. Recently, Horton and others have warned us about empire being replaced by empire. Chaudhry and others cite Frantz Fanon in talking about becoming the man. Ambedkar from India used to call this the infection of imitation, where hierarchy so infuses us that we resist it by imitating it, by merely, flipping it. So it's exactly what you're talking about. That we rehearse and imitate the roles and customs of oppressors and colonized to assert our power or legitimacy. But, as Audre Lorde warns, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Let's think about that a bit. And ethics of partnership, therefore, is about finding our way and roaming through our science together, rather than learning to read a single map made by one of us. Tools, therefore, in this journey come and go. And some of us discussed this a little bit yesterday, and Korzybski's concept of maps not being the territory. Tools are not reality. I'd like to quote a Martinican polymath, Edouard Lisson, introduced to me also last week by our Praxis colleagues, and I continue to voraciously read them. He wrote a book called Poetics of Relation, and he introduces this concept of errantry. Errantry is a kind of moving around. It feels like wandering, but it's not. He clarifies, and I quote, "Wandering, one might become lost. But in errantry, one knows at every moment where one is, at every moment in relation to the other." So akin to the idea of self-reflexivity that Cesar was talking about. In the Poetics of Relation, one who is errant, who is no longer traveler, discoverer, or conqueror, strives to know the totality of the world, yet already knows that she will never accomplish this, and knows that it is precisely where the threatened beauty of the world resides. So a little bit of poetry also added, okay? So Glisson is a poet. So in short, tools like equity, whether for partnerships or otherwise, will never succeed in conventional terms. In failing, they will change and may actually help advance our work. So now let's hop back to islands 2 and 3. And I'm doing that for a reason as I close. Back in India, we're trying out errantry. We're in early stages of errantry as part of another partnership. And it's one of those large consortium projects. It's related to universal health coverage and health systems and social participation. We are straining against tools and maps, norms of who can hold the contract, to who owns the intellectual property, at every stage presented as a done deal, presented as facts. This is what Glissant calls imperial peace. This is where relations break down, because we are merely keeping the peace. Our group is not quite a peaceful bunch, though. The grant contract is not yet signed, partly because we haven't been very peaceful about that process. Many of us have been journeying together for about 2 years, some as long as 15 years, so it's been a while. Our work is in Vietnam, India, Thailand, and the UK. And often, without even wanting to, we find ourselves challenging a universalist ethics of partnership. There are, for each of us, even within countries, multiple ways of being in and seeing the world. Though I will say that the automatic binaries in a lot of the writing on this of West and East don't really pan out in our case. For example, there are epistemic and ontological injustices manifest in the queer rights movement in Thailand and India, for example. These injustices invisibilize certain groups like transmasculine people, even on platforms of social participation. And actually, some of these groups don't want to fight for their visibility. They don't want platforms, right? They just want their privacy. They just want to live. They want to be left alone. In Vietnam, the vocabulary of key populations and globalized HIV activism shapes discourse and possibilities of action. How then, across Vietnam, Thailand, and India, do we align on a research goal and a political project? We realized when we met this September that we don't have to. To explain this, let me return to a final metaphor from Glissant. This is paraphrased wonderfully by Hannah Fleischman just last month. I can share the article with you. So, quote, in reference to his birthplace, the Caribbean islands, Glissant refers to himself as a philosopher of the archipelago. Simply put, an archipelago is a cluster of islands. Archipelagic thinking stands in opposition to continental thinking, which favors unity and coherence, facilitated by systematic organizational structures. In contrast, the configuration of the archipelago focuses on incoherence and asymmetry, creating complex networks that encourage horizontal exchange between isolated parts. Continental thinking relates to space as fixed blocks. This informs a centralized and systematic knowledge production, highlighting the idea of a single truth. Inspired by the dispersed and diverse archipelago, archipelagic thinking encourages various emergent truths and a dynamic relationship to identity. Glissant refers to the archipelago as, quote, a place where we can begin to understand and resolve the contradictions of the world, end quote. He states that continents weigh us down. I realize I say this standing on the African continent, but he does say this. Continents weigh us down. They are thick and sumptuous. Archipelagos are able to diffract. They create diversity and expansiveness. Being in harmony with the world through archipelagos means inhabiting this diffraction. Diffraction here describes a process by which, many of us know this, diffraction is a process by which any wave, sound, light, radio, water, diverges from a straight line transmission due to an obstacle in its path, right? So is an ethics of equitable partnership then, rather than a set of master principles or a single continent, instead an archipelago, places, journeys, relations, tables to resolve contradiction, to create diversity, expansiveness, to hobble over obstacles, to diffract into zigzagging new paths, and lead to what Glissant calls the imprévisible, the unforeseen, the not yet knowable, or not pre-knowable. Could this very meeting be about that? We're already sitting in islands. We're already doing group work. I think we're on our way. So then let me leave you with these 5 themes as we move into that the forum. Island 1, we are all learners. Island 2, doing nothing is the everything. Island 3, care, patience, and time is the demand of decolonial scholarship. Island 1 again, Errantry, not tools, as praxis. And islands 2 and 3, zigzagging. Partnership as archipelago. Good luck diffracting and enjoy the forum.
Thank you. Just 2 questions. Yes. Thank you very much, Devaki. I think we have time for just 2 questions. One for Caesar and one for Devaki. Anyone? Questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. So the last time I had the good fortune to listen to Caesar talk, you mentioned the concept of solidarity, deep solidarity, and I was wondering if you had thought at all about the relationship between solidarity and power.
Thank you for that. I was beginning to fear that each time I'm given the microphone, I talk about solidarity. So today I didn't go on the solidarity line. But yes, there is a strong relationship between solidarity and power. On the one hand, when power becomes oppressive, what it tends to do is it operates on individuals or on smaller units. And one way to combat oppressive structures is by coming together in solidarity. So many solidaristic movements are always, positioned to fight against oppression and against structures that are oppressive. So that is one thing. And secondly, solidarity also provides some form of power. So it works against oppressive power, and it also empowers, it enables those people who come in together in solidarity to be able to, as it were, make their voice or their action or get very concrete. We spoke about this in the United States today. Just in the past few months, it was quite common that political authorities were beginning to single out academics who are critical and attack them. Now, that leads to many academics self-censoring, and people just become scared and they don't say what they want to say because there is too much at risk. How does solidarity and power come in here? On the one hand, and another just a small premise, people who tend to be from the higher classes are very bad at being in solidarity. And if the academics could come together in solidarity, then they'd be able to fight the attacks. But as long as you stay as individuals, it is easier for the regime to crush you. And we see that here. Gordon can confirm it, even though he's now in university management. He knows that the union of university academics in Ghana is feared. Because when we go on strike, as a solidarity group, we can demand anything, even from the government. So solidarity can empower individuals, and it can also be a resistance, a tool of resistance against oppression. However, within solidaristic groups themselves, there can sometimes even be a power struggle within the groups. So it's a bit of a complex relationship at different levels, if I may say. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Prof. And okay. Great. So join me to thank Caesar and Devaki. Thank you very much. Thank you.